like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into Winter Storm Blair. And this one looks like it could be pretty intense.
Yeah, it really does. The Weather Channel article that you sent me really highlights how widespread the storm is expected to be, potentially the biggest one we've seen all season, stretching all the way from the Rockies to the East Coast.
Wow. Okay, so let's break it down. Right now, Blair is making its way across through the Rockies, bringing some rain and mountain snow.
Right, but here's where the timeline gets kind of interesting. By Saturday, the storm shifts to the plains, bringing heavy snow, and continues to move east through the weekend. And Sunday night into Monday, folks in the mid-Atlantic better really start paying attention. We're talking Baltimore, Pittsburgh, even Washington, D.C., and we might even see some lingering effects going into Tuesday morning.
Gotcha. Okay, now the article mentioned both snow and ice, and I'm curious about how those two play into the severity of the storm.
Yeah, that's a good point. While heavy snow can be disruptive, ice can be much more dangerous. Think about it. A thick layer of ice on a tree branch can add hundreds of pounds of extra weight, putting immense stress on the branch and making it much more likely to snap, potentially taking down power lines with it.
Oh, wow. So if heavy snow means grabbing a shovel, does heavy ice mean it's time to stock up on flashlights and extra batteries?
Exactly. In those areas, expecting significant icing power outages become a real concern.
Yeah, and the map shows those darker pink and purple areas are at the highest risk for ice accumulation. So listeners, if you're in one of those zones, this would be a good time to double-check your emergency supplies.
Absolutely, and the article specifically mentions an ice storm warning being issued for southern Missouri. And an ice storm warning means they're expecting enough ice accumulation to cause widespread power outages and to make travel extremely dangerous.
Okay, so ice storm warning, definitely not something you want to ignore. But let's back up and talk about the snow for a minute.
Sure. For folks in the Central Plains and the Midwest, think Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. You're likely looking at some heavy snowfall, potentially 6 inches or more. Some areas could even see over a foot of accumulation.
Wow, a foot of snow. That's significant. And what about the Mid-Atlantic? What's the forecast looking like there?
It's kind of a mixed bag for that region. D.C. and Baltimore could see a decent amount of snow, maybe up to 6 inches, but there's also a chance of sleet mixing in, which would mean less overall accumulation. Philadelphia could also see a few inches.
Okay, so we've got heavy snow in the Midwest, a mix of snow and ice in the Mid-Atlantic, and that serious ice threat further south. It sounds like travel is going to be a major concern across a huge swath of the country.
You're absolutely right. The article highlights widespread travel disruption, especially on Sunday and for those Monday morning commutes. Cities like Kansas City, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, and Louisville are all expected to see treacherous conditions on Sunday.
And then on Monday morning, the focus shifts to the Mid-Atlantic, with Baltimore, Charleston, West Virginia, Cincinnati again, Philly, Pittsburgh, and D.C. all bracing for some potentially dangerous commutes.
And this brings up a really important point about forecasting. You know, predicting winter storms can be incredibly challenging. There are so many variables at play.
That makes sense. It's not like predicting a sunny day in July. So how do meteorologists even approach forecasting something as complex as a winter storm? What are some of the factors that make it so tricky?
Well, think of it like a giant puzzle where the pieces are constantly shifting. You've got temperature gradients, moisture levels, wind patterns, elevation changes. All these factors kind of interact in complex ways. And even small variations can lead to vastly different outcomes.
So even with all of our advanced technology and modeling, there's always an element of uncertainty when it comes to winter storms.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to stay informed and be prepared for a range of possibilities. And speaking of preparedness, let's talk about some concrete steps our listeners can take to get ready for Blair's impact.
Okay, so we've already touched on having emergency supplies like flashlights, batteries, non-perishable food, especially for those who might experience power outages. What else should be on our listeners' checklist?
Well, first, think about medications. If you or someone in your household relies on prescription medications, make sure you have an adequate supply on hand in case you're unable to get to a pharmacy.
Right. And what about people who rely on medical equipment that requires electricity? That adds another layer of complexity to storm preparation.
Absolutely. In those cases, it's crucial to have a plan in place. Talk to your healthcare provider about backup power options or alternative arrangements if a power outage occurs.
Okay, so we've got medications, medical equipment covered. What about our furry family members? Pets need special consideration during severe weather, too.
Right. Make sure they have a safe, warm place to stay inside. Plenty of food and water, and consider having their identification tags updated, just in case they get separated from you during the storm.
Okay, good point. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about home safety. Are there any steps our listener can take to prepare their property for potential snow and ice?
Yeah, think about things like dead branches or trees that could become hazards in heavy snow or ice. If it's safe to do so, trimming them back now could prevent damage later. And if you have a snowblower, make sure it's in good working order and that you have enough fuel on hand.
Okay. And what about staying informed during the storm itself? What are the best resources for getting real-time updates?
Well, the Weather Channel app is a fantastic resource for up-to-the-minute forecasts and alerts. You can also sign up for local emergency notifications through your city or county's website. And of course, social media can be helpful for checking in on neighbors and getting local updates, although it's always important to verify information from official sources.
Yeah, for sure. You know, this conversation about power outages and potential hazards, it really highlights how interconnected our lives are and how easily those connections can be disrupted by severe weather. It makes you think about things we often take for granted, like electricity and transportation.
You're right. And I think that's an important point for our listeners to consider. How would your daily life be impacted if you lost power for a few days? Could you work from home? Would you be able to cook meals? How would you stay warm? Thinking through these scenarios in advance can help you feel more prepared and less overwhelmed if they do occur.
Yeah. And it's not just about individual preparedness, is it? These kinds of storms often have broader economic and societal impacts as well.
Exactly. Think about the businesses that might have to close due to power outages, the supply chains that could be disrupted, the potential strain on emergency services. It's a ripple effect that extends far beyond the immediate impact of the storm itself.
We touched on travel disruptions earlier, and the article specifically mentioned a number of major cities that could be significantly impacted.
Yes. And if travel is unavoidable during the storm, it's essential to check road conditions frequently and allow yourself plenty of extra time. And remember, even if the roads look clear, black ice can be a hidden danger, especially at night and in the early morning hours. Black ice is essentially a thin, transparent layer of ice that's very difficult to see, making it particularly treacherous for drivers.
So let's say our listener lives in one of those cities like Kansas City or St. Louis, and they wake up to a foot of snow. What are their next steps? What should they prioritize?
First and foremost, take a deep breath and assess the situation. Is it safe to venture outside? Are there any downed power lines or other hazards? If it's safe to go out, then you can start thinking about things like clearing snow. But remember, safety always comes first.
And even if it seems safe, there's still the issue of black ice, right?
Absolutely. That's why it's so important to move cautiously and be aware of your surroundings.
Well, assuming it's safe to venture out, what about clearing snow? Any tips for our listeners?
Shoveling snow can be strenuous, so take frequent breaks and stay hydrated. If you have any underlying health conditions, consider asking a neighbor or friend for help. And dress warmly in layers. It's easy to underestimate how quickly you can lose body heat when you're out in the cold.
And what about driving? Any advice for those who absolutely can't avoid being on the roads during the storm?
If you must drive, make sure your car is properly equipped for winter weather. Good tires with plenty of tread working lights, a full tank of gas, and above all, slow down. Speed is a major factor in winter weather accidents.
Great reminders. Now, I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about the bigger picture. These kinds of extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and intense, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed or even powerless in the face of that.
That's a very valid point. And, that feeling of being overwhelmed is something we hear a lot from our listeners. So what can we do both individually and collectively to cope with this new reality of a changing climate?
That's a huge question, and one we could probably spend an entire episode unpacking. But I'm curious to get your initial thoughts. What are some small but meaningful actions we can take to feel more empowered in the face of these challenges?
Well, for starters, we can focus on building resilience in our own communities. That means checking in on our neighbors, especially elderly or vulnerable individuals who might need extra support during severe weather. It means supporting local organizations that are working to mitigate climate change and prepare for its impacts.
I love that. It's about taking action at a local level, even when the problem feels global. And speaking of global, it's important to stay informed about climate change science and policy, both at the national and international level.
Right, because informed citizens are empowered citizens. And don't underestimate the power of voting for leaders who prioritize climate action.
Absolutely. Our choices at the ballot box can have a ripple effect, influencing policy decisions. That impact not only our local communities, but the world as a whole.
And, beyond the political realm, there's so much we can do in our own daily lives. From reducing our carbon footprint to supporting sustainable businesses, every small action contributes to a larger solution.
And sometimes it's about changing our mindset. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem, we can choose to focus on the solutions, on the positive actions we can take, both individually and collectively.
I love that framing. It's about shifting from a sense of powerlessness to a sense of agency. And that shift in and of itself can be incredibly empowering.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Winter Storm Blair, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. Even in the face of a blizzard or an ice storm, there's still room for hope, for resilience, and for action.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about the challenges we face, the better equipped we are to navigate them and create a more sustainable future for ourselves and for generations to come.
Well said. Now, before we sign off, I want to remind our listeners that the Weather Channel app is your go-to resource for the latest updates on Winter Storm Blair. Stay safe out there, deep divers.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to process, especially with a storm of this magnitude heading our way. But I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from understanding the science behind the storm to some practical tips for staying safe and even some broader reflections on climate change and resilience.
Yeah, we have. And I think it's a good reminder that knowledge is power in these situations. The more we understand about the challenges we face, the better equipped we are to navigate them.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Winter Storm Blair, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier, the fact that this storm is bringing a double whammy of snow and ice, and that the impact really depends on your location.
Right, and that leads us to a question I think is particularly relevant for you listening today. Thinking about your own location and what we've learned about Blair's potential path, what's one thing you can do today to prepare yourself and your loved ones? That's a great question to consider. It could be as simple as making sure your flashlight batteries are fresh, or maybe it's digging out your snow shovel and making sure it's ready to go. Or perhaps it's something more involved, like having a conversation with your family about what you'll do if the power goes out.
The point is to take action, even a small one. It can make a world of difference in feeling more prepared and less overwhelmed.
I completely agree. And remember, we'll be keeping a close eye on Blair's progress and sharing any major updates as they develop. Be sure to check back with weather.com or the Weather Channel app for the latest information.
Stay warm and stay safe out there. Even though winter storms can feel daunting, a little preparation goes a long way.
And remember, even though we're talking about a powerful winter storm, this deep dive has really been about more than just the weather. It's about understanding risk-building resilience and taking action both individually and collectively to create a safer and more sustainable future.
Well said. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay connected.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.